we are at Casmo, and we are about to have a conversation with Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, University Professor at Columbia University. And we are together at Casmo because of a symposium that has been going on for 2 days, sponsored by the Estonian Humanities Institute, as the prelude to this year's Tallinn University Summer School on the topic of globalizations in plural. And Professor Spivak has kindly consented to continuing the conversation that has been going on for a couple of days now. And there are some others of us who are very happy to be in her company, to having the conversation. My name is Tina Kiers. I am Professor of Cultural Theory at Tallinn University as of this fall. And with me around the table are Professor Tino Wiik in philosophy at Tallinn University, and George Schöpfling with a fascinating intellectual biography, including being currently a member of the European Parliament from Hungary, and Professor Rein Raud, Rector of Tallinn University. So, and Professor of
Asian Studies and Cultural Theory at the Estonian Institute of Humanities, as well as Professor of Japanese Studies at the University of Helsinki.
Thank you. And our conversation over the last couple of days has been on many topics, but by kind of an informal or unspoken consensus, we agreed to talk today about teaching the humanities, which is a topic that I know Professor Spivak is passionately committed to in many places in the world. And so I wanted to begin by asking about a phrase that you have been using in your writing, in interviews, and a couple of times over the last couple of days. And if I am correct, you talk about teaching humanities and specifically literature as having something to do with the non-coercive reorganization of desire. And I wanted to ask you, perhaps, to begin the conversation there with that phrase, and perhaps moving on in whatever direction you feel you'd like to.
Actually, my phrase is more humble. It's the rearrangement, like rearranging furniture, rearrangement of desire. I think it's too much to claim change, making people change their minds. At least in my 45-year-old experience of full-time university teaching, I don't believe I've changed more than 1.5 months. But so rearranging desire, it seems to me, is a responsible kind of task, because in order to rearrange something, you have to know it very well, so that you really have to focus on your class carefully, the composition of the class, in order to see how you, I mean, I think people do this anyway, I just happen to stumble on the phrase. And so I think that's what the humanities do. And uncoercive is hard word, because in general education there is an element of coercion in education. I mean, not terrible coercion, but there is something. It is my feeling that through humanities teaching, not I mean literature and philosophy, you actually do something which you don't quite know. You have plans, but the change that happens is quite often unexpected. Something will have happened as a result of your planned work. And that's where the uncoercive comes in. If you're good enough, then it's not just what you're planning, you're leaving room for other kinds of change to happen. You're surprised by whatever is happening. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I hope I've given you enough of a description to start with.
Mm-hmm. Why literature and philosophy? This is not a question about disciplines, but about, from what I've sensed in your writings and in your speaking, there is power, an incredible amount of power that comes from reading a literary text. One is faced with certain things. What is it about literature and philosophy?
I believe that when we are thinking about the humanities angle, we are talking about teaching reading and teaching philosophizing. Of course you teach history of literature, of course you teach intellectual history, various philosophers, what they thought, etc. But through it, you are, in my view, teaching a certain kind of activity which actually leads to, dare I say this, the possibility of a good society. So it seems to me that those skills, the skill of reading the world in the most active sense, because that's what a democracy requires, judgment. You do not vote with bureaucratic egalitarianism for everyone. And you should not vote, and I live in the United States, I know whereof I speak, you should not vote in terms of campaign rhetoric. And you should not vote in a kind of block vote way, right? That's an undoing of democracy. So it's a women's vote, Hispanic vote, I think is very scary. So to an extent, through this reading and philosophizing, you teach judgment. That, I mean, Kant thought that it was through the aesthetic that judgment came in. That is to say, not something for which you had, concepts for which you had objective reality, but through this possibility, the human possibility of representing something. That's why Hannah Arendt thought that the aesthetic was the political in Kant. I think that's going perhaps a little too far. But nonetheless, that's why I'm so keen on the literary and the philosophical as activist disciplines.
We've also been very clear about the importance of reading the text and of learning language. And I remember a number of years back when, I think it was the second time I saw you speak, I believe it was in Montreal at an ACLA convention, and you, in responding to a question, got very angry at someone who was prepared to homogenize or sacrifice or give up the disciplined learning another language, the kinds of humilities that required. And I remember that it was very empowering for me as a teacher of literature, who at that time was having to apologize for teaching French and German and insisting that even in a halting way, students make contact with that kind of learning. It's also the kind of learning that doesn't get financed very much.
No.
And so I was wondering if you could comment on the cultural situation of asking students to do these things and doing it with them in these times.
I have lost hope. So I hope you will make me feel more hopeful about this. But I mean, my biggest allies at my university where I teach, they will begin discussions by saying, but not language, Gayatri, because it's really not the one. I mean, your rector speaks 20 languages. I think this is a very wonderful thing. I mean, in order to get into a lingual memory, which is, I've been saying that I'm rather suspicious of the idea of cultural memory, but on the other hand, the idea of a lingual memory, which is not my own, it's out of Mecca's, this is at University of Michigan.
Yes.
Yes. So that is really, it's the way I speak English. I believe I've entered the lingual memory of English. It's not just understanding jokes, but there is something like an impersonal memory within a language, which is how you really learn cultures. Today, because of globalization, this is our topic, people are constantly wanting to learn cultures. You don't learn cultures, you learn languages. And if you go through that way, see, it is my belief, and this is why we are not given money, we are not funded. It is my belief that the humanities should acknowledge that their strength is in the fact that they cannot be fully global because of the diversity of languages in the world. That they have to supplement, and by supplement, of course, I mean that there is a pre-existing lack in globalization, even good globalization. And so that they have, so that they can provide a world. A world comes from the language situation. And it seems to me that, I mean, I've just very recently published this piece, that our understanding of comparative literature should be to acknowledge that the first language that we learn, which is before sentience, as it were, it actually activates the meta-psychological, what is not just psychological, and it helps us to get into ethical semiosis, all of that stuff. And the understanding that I have of comparative literature is to respect all languages as having, if it's a language, then an infant can learn it. And if it's an infant who's learning it, this is the way it's learning it. That all languages, in fact, have this capacity before grammar, as it were, inventing a language that the parents recognize, and then it gets written into a named language. And that within comparative literature we should try to produce something which is almost a simulacrum of this. Who's going to give us money for that kind of thing? We're interested in speed.
Yes.
Well, speaking about languages, I would say that actually learning another language always relativizes the way how you have conceived of language as such before. Well, of course, this is a trivial thing to say that you can't understand your own language before you have learned at least one foreign language. One foreign language may also not be enough if it's structurally close enough. And know these North American linguists who know English and possibly German, and then they say, oh yeah, all languages of the world, they're structured more or less the same way. But even so, even learning a close language still relativizes what you know of your own, and the further you get, the more interesting it actually becomes.
I would take it a stage further, because I'm in the happy or unhappy position of being bilingual with English and Hungarian. And I would say that it relativizes the world. It relativizes how you understand the world, because you know that one language says, this is the absolute truth, and the other language says, no, that's the absolute truth. And the more you go down that road, the more you understand, but to some extent your own contingency, and actually really the contingency of the world. You realize that when people are making absolute statements, maybe absolute in that relatively narrow, confined context, but then there are other contexts where it has no meaning whatever, there's no resonance. I think we're safe to say that the structural similarity between English and Hungarian is quite distant. So that kind of problem doesn't arise. And I think, in a sense, taking up another point to do with the aesthetic education, what I'm very conscious of is that the Anglo-Saxon world is profoundly hostile to aesthetics. The Central European thought world is actually very open to it. And I've thought quite a lot about why this should be so. I think in Central Europe, whether one is Catholic or Protestant, we live with the legacy of the Baroque. North European Baroque, so very particular, is different from the South European Baroque. But at the centre of it is a proposition that through aesthetic beauty, we create a community and we get closer to God. So even if one is secular, the idea that there should be beauty, for example, the elegance of language is important. It's regarded as very secondary. Contemporary English, I think it was not so in the 19th century. And in that sense, I certainly have a very clear understanding of quite radical differences, and that also means that what I grew up with when I lived in Britain, enormous pressure, anti-elitism and equality. Now, I don't actually think that equality has any meaning, especially not in a post-material world. I'd like to see equivalence. It's much more difficult because you have to recognize the difference, and we were talking earlier, the distinctions that we should be able to make about the world are much more difficult to do if we have to go some distance into another culture. Much more difficult. I mean, think about the 22 miles separating England and France. Chalk and cheese, two utterly different worlds. They don't understand each other, never have and never will, I suspect.
But you know, this business of equivalence, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is the word I use in this rethinking comparativism. The piece, I say that you must realize that as language, since it can be learned in that metapsychological ethical symbiosis way, all languages are equivalent. I'm not talking about some kind of Boas-like cultural equality, no. I'm talking about this kind of equivalence which my mother made me realize. I tell the story in the piece. We were in Paris for a whole week listening to colloque franco-indien, etc. Wonderful academic French. And then we're standing in the airport and I hear the accents of upstate New York. I'm not going to imitate it. And I went to school at Cornell and I turned to my mother and I said in Bengali, I can't lift it into my ear. And my mother, who was born in 1913, very active in all India Women's Congress, etc., says to me, dear, it's a mother tongue. She gives to English the possibility of being understood as a language that can be learnt by an infant for this ethical semiosis stuff. I got it from her first. Equivalence. Thank you for using that word.
By some reason, I'm not sure at all that, that learning several languages will teach us that the world is relative, or that it breaks up some kind of monotheistic seeing of that. It simply relativizes the language that I'm using. It could also relativize the world once, but further rational steps are needed for that.
You must learn it well, remember, that's what I said. It's very easy to learn languages badly. When it doesn't do anything.
True, and once you learn it well, you already emerge into another cultural situation, which that I agree would relativize the world, because then you have two worldviews, as if.
But the language, just as a culture, evolves in a certain environment, and it has to perform certain tasks. And actually, when you learn a language, you should also think of why do you learn the language, what do you learn it for, why, where and how and why you want to use it. And sometimes you end up doing fairly different things depending on what your purpose is. But the point is that if you have learned a language which is used, let's say, in a basically middle-class run society with academia, with TV and such, and then you learn a language which is used by, let's say, a community somewhere in the Amazon jungles, then you can't expect that these two languages will have the same kind of functions. And of course the sort of traditional progressivist European way would say, well, our languages are more developed and theirs are more primitive. Well, let's take somebody out of these jungles and put him on the streets of London or New York and see how they survive. Well, the opposite is equally true. You put someone from New York into these jungles and they won't survive either. I suppose they will probably get down more quickly.
I think if you put somebody from the streets of New York and the streets of London, they'd have difficulty.
But you know, in terms of language skills, I would like to use an example here. I have a very fine British student, white British student, who came to Columbia, and apparently he had read somewhere that I had said, if you want to study the British 19th century, then you should know one of the colonized languages. It's much more interesting because some of us who happen to have them as native languages do it in a certain way, but you should know. So he learned Bengali. He learned Bengali and he wrote one chapter of his dissertation on really a very fine Bengali novelist. And he gives lectures in Calcutta and so on and so forth. I mean, he's really good. I mean, Ben Baer is his name, and he has a piece coming out in the publication of the Modern Language Association of America. You will see. He teaches at Princeton. But he's also helping me in these village schools, training teachers. And the truth of a remark that I've made, and people think I'm just being politically correct, comes true. Ben knows that to know a language well enough to write a chapter in a dissertation and to give lectures at Jadavpur and to publish in PMLN is well and good. But if you want to engage rural children and in a remote area and teach them mathematics and geography, you need to know the language backwards in a different way. When I had said this kind of a thing before, he said, oh, Gayatri Spivak, you know, she's so politically correct. She's always thinking about class. But it's a practical fact.
I find that in many ways a great deal of my life experience was learned through English, and the vocabulary in English is probably a little closer than it is in Hungarian. I can operate pretty much every context in Hungarian, a difficulty with the language of the law, which I think is probably a meta-language that's difficult and to some extent one-sided everywhere. For me, both are equally authentic. For certain purposes, I would prefer to use English, other purposes I prefer to use Hungarian, but if I have to, I can use either, with these few exceptions. But coming back to the point, I think every language, in a sense, is a way of world-making. They may be quite alike, those worlds, they may be very different indeed. And there will be differences which at the end of the day, work can only be understood if you're deep inside that language. You pick up the literary resonances, you know, the highest level of culture, historical references, painting, the local canon is, in a sense, is what I'm talking about. It's a canon which is not going to be outside that culture. And if you're going to be operating on the basis of equivalence in both cultures, in both linguistic worlds, then it's very hard work. It's very hard work to maintain it because, of course, both keep changing and you keep running very hard to stay in the same place.
But could we get back to the topic we started from? Now listeners, we are speaking about learning languages as resulting some change in us, some making us better people, or seeing the world in a better way, and that has been, I think, the very idea of humanistic education from the beginning on. Plato would call it, why do we do all the stuff we do at school? And namely, why do we learn poetry and do gymnastics and later deal with philosophy? It turns our soul upside down. I don't know if that's a kind of rearrangement of desire, but it turns our soul upside down in a way that now we start to see this other world of ideas as well. In addition to that, now I don't know if our humanistic education, if the goal is exactly that, but there is clearly more than providing us instruments for communication or instruments for dealing with the world. I think that this subjective dimension of humanistic education and comparative literature included, that's extremely important, and that's very much what is forgotten in the nowadays in the university arrangements, when we talk about university politics and so on.
But you know, in the philosophy area, as an outsider, although I'm somewhat interdisciplinary in literature and philosophy, it's also trying to think about living, dying, doing, learning, etc. Not just learning about other philosophers, the body-mind relationship. This is the big one, right? And it does seem to me that we don't necessarily become better people. I think that could be claiming something that I will let Plato claim. I think we become more flexible. And I've seen very good people who wouldn't recognize a line of good poetry. So I must respect that. But I think we become more flexible, and I come back to what I was saying, that the facility to judge, rather than simply say, this is what I like, or what I hear in the United States, a good deal, unless you enforce something. Enforcement is the name of the game across the human rights lobby now. But I believe in the 18th century European idea, which you have to turn around, that somehow one can make the will come close to being identical with the law.
Could I ask you, pick you up on one thing? You said that we don't become better people, but would you not think that maybe we become better people in relation to our earlier selves?
I said we don't necessarily become better people. I think the possibility of becoming better is opened up by this flexibility. See, my problem is that, and I hope you don't mind my saying this, I tend to distrust intellectuals. I'm not an anti-intellectual person at all. I love thinking. It's perhaps the only thing that I really do enjoy. But nonetheless, quote, intellectuals, unquote, so difficult to make changes, so a certain kind of credulous vanity, the idea that they have much more effect in the world. You should know, you're a parliamentarian, that they have much more effect in the world than we do, and so on. So therefore, I say that, because the other side otherwise won't believe me, they just patronize me if I say we become good. I will say that this flexibility opens up the possibility of, because I don't know what it is to be good, frankly. So flexibility I can recognize. So that's where I will
But
stop.
I think you don't mean flexibility in an instrumental term, as if As if, for example, we get from self-help books when they say that, well, just smile to yourself in the mirror every day and you'll be happy.
You read self-help books?
Sometimes I do. I study them. So this purely instrumentalist approach would also not go, because being flexible, you probably mean it being flexible in terms of also more open towards the world, ideas.
It's the relative business. You see, I'm nearly 70 years old. I go to the gym, right? So I can touch my toes, for example, okay, and I can sit up. And that's, without putting my hands on the floor. That's what I meant when it's almost like this aesthetic training, which is the imaginative training for epistemological performance, is like this body-mind business. It's like going to the gym. You don't become an athlete, but the possibility of using your body in ways that are more interesting than simply giving in to aging is opened up. That's what I was.
But in that case, our academic education is very much working on a different direction. We build those towers around us. We learn to defend the positions we're holding simply because we have been holding them, and we're learning to defend them better. As Jean-Paul Sartre has a really good idea about self-deception or bad consciousness, as he says. He's asked if education in general and intellectual people, if they deceive themselves less than others because they're so clever. No, he says they still deceive themselves, but in a much more clever way.
So that they can be self-deceived. Yeah.
Jung put this slightly differently. The more the light, the bigger the shadow.
I wanted to ask you to come back to the question of language. You have invested an enormous amount of time in translating, which is another one of those activities that I know in contemporary Estonia and those other places in the world too, is both a highly marketable thing from some sectors, and in other respects, like an academic resume, is hardly tolerated. It's seen as the wrong use of time in view of scholarly articles and so forth. And I remember some of my earliest readings of your work led me for the first time to Masweta Devi's work, which without your work as the kind of translator that Walter Benjamin is envisioning when he talks about the Aufgabe, the task of the translator, would never have happened. I would never have read Masweta Devi, I think, without your having translated her and introduced me to her. So can you talk about your sense of what translation means, why it's important, what are its tasks, its powers, its dangers?
It's changed over time. It's I just did the Modern Language Association of America, our professional organization in the United States, had a translation as its theme last year, and I was on the presidential forum, and I'm in a kind of double, I've been for a long time, although I've also changed, in a kind of double bind with translation, especially since I translate into English. It's, I have been pushing, again without much hope, to make translation into an active pursuit rather than simply a convenience which is the end of the line. I'm just editing a series for Palgrave on theory and translation, and I've just finished the general introduction, the series introduction, where I say in the end, and in fact I said to the translators, for heaven's sake, discuss problems in translation as much as you can. Teaching Aristotle, for example, I will say to my sophomore students, and I teach sophomores by choice, I will say to them, look at, this was written before there was English, and that what's happening with mimesis poiesis is not what happens with imitation and poetry. And when he says that it's a noble praxis that's in mimesis, he doesn't mean what you folks think praxis is, which is like going out on a human rights expedition. So you've got to begin to feel that this is even if you don't know classical Greek, you've got to hit your head against it. So I do feel that it should be it should lead to a dissatisfaction with the text. And it should, if you share the problems in translation, and it should lead to language learning. Otherwise, I'm in a double bind. I want to translate Loin de Medine of Asir Jabbar for the Bangladesh women's movement into Bengali. But because there is no market, no commission, and there are all of these other things lined up, it's getting pushed backwards. It's getting pushed backwards. And I will not translate through English. I will translate by entering the lingual memory of the very few, handful, really few languages that I know. I too am bilingual in English and Bengali. I'm not trilingual or quadri, but nonetheless, when you translate, you have to enter the protocols of the language.
I fully support you in this, and you also come up against the problem fairly quickly that some things are untranslatable. Or maybe the cost of translating it is so enormous, huge long footnotes, which actually nobody's going to read. So you just don't. And then there are certain structural elements, very difficult. English, as you know, likes short sentences. Good English is plain English, so that's what I was taught. We know the reality is actually somewhat different. Good Hungarian is very convoluted long sentences, very difficult to translate, very difficult to translate into English. You do it quite reasonably into German. What do you actually do? What are you translating? How do you translate this thought world into one which is actually quite inimical to it? Or sometimes it's a matter of straight mistranslation with far-reaching consequences. I'm trying to remember the authors involved, but sometime in the early 18th century, somebody translated the French personne morale as a moral person. It's not. It's a legal person. They built a whole structure of ideals on the idea of there being a moral person. Well, this is a total mistranslation. I mean, it would never be tolerated, let's say, in cooking. If you mistranslate a recipe, you're in real trouble.
You know, I say that all the time, that if manual labor were performed with the kind of carelessness with which you're performing intellectual labor, not well. But also, you know, if you think about it, forget sense. It's the sound, the phonetic element cannot be translated. And there's a line in Mallarmé, the mon je étonnement, mon je étonnement, and je monotonement. Okay, close to this sound. You can't do anything. Heidegger, for example, who's kind of doing this what's it called? You know, that figure of speech where the same word is used in many kind of as noun, as adjective, as verb. Yes, that he does that. That's what his philosophy is based on. You can't do that in English. So the phonetic element, which the reader must want to grab, is something that should seduce them a little, should tempt them a little.
Let me give you one example that does work. You know, of course, the artist Marcel Duchamp. He published a text under the pseudonym of Marchand du Sel, which is translated into English as salt cellar.
That's good, yes.
Occasionally
it works.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about something else that's been intriguing me. I have struggled with great delight with some of your essays on Marx. And where we're sitting here today is a place where the word Marx, the name Marx, is definitely not the most popular and is regarded with great suspicion. And in fact, a couple of years ago, when I asked my students to read Marx and Engels, they couldn't find it in the library. Not in Berlin, it was in Dortmund. But my question is, and I take this from an interview that was done with you many, many years ago, very simple question. When should one stop reading Marx? And I'll add my corollary question. Why should people in post-Soviet Estonia, post-Soviet world continue to read Marx?
Because of the terrible things perpetrated in the name of a text. That's why I think, in fact, this is the moment for reopening Marx. As to when one should stop reading anything, I don't know. I don't know. But it does seem to me that one must not expect Marx's texts to do everything for one. It also seems to me that it's basically a kind of tour de force of a philosopher wanting to, I mean, if you look at the making of Marx's Capital, which is of course Capital 1, the idea of changing the desire of the working class from thinking of themselves as victims of capitalism to agents of production, that was a noble idea in the 19th century, it seems to me. And one must, you see, when I teach Marx, we read about 1,000 pages of Marx, German on one side, English on the other. I'm a comparative literature person. I mean, the mistranslations of Marx, in fact, blood has flown. And so, in fact, what I say to my students, I don't think everybody should teach this way. I'm talking about a literature teacher who doesn't have much scholarship in political theory, etc. So I say to them, let us imagine that this is a new book. Remember, there was no book at one point, and then this book began. So we all know that it has a history, that there's Marxist scholarship, etc., etc. But on the other hand, you must also think of it as something that was being written by someone who has this kind of textual history. So it seems to me that it's a very interesting thing to read if one looks at the fact that he's talking about capital rising out of the difference between making and needing, you know, and you see that's kind of a heteronormativity. It's not auto-normativity. Things arise, art arises out of this difference. So if you go upstream from it, and then the idea of the homeopathy of, you know, commodifying your labor and using it, was what it means. International socialism died because of the huge ethics-shaped hole. So what it means is there is a real double bind between the two uses of the word social. On the one hand, there is this idea of the commodification, homeopathic self-commodification to make a welfare state. It's a 19th century idea, but nonetheless. On the other side, there's this whole humanistic notion of the word social, which a guy with a PhD in Greek philosophy took for granted. And so in the rift between those two, the assumption that freedom from leads to freedom to, how on earth could one actually take that as a blueprint for a society? See, so therefore, to an extent, the time for reopening that text in a judicious way, rather than in a fundamentalist spirit, it has come. I mean, I don't learn feminism from Marx. I do not learn world literature from Marx. I think some of my colleagues have gone the wrong way in deciding that Marx is going to tell them about literary criticism. I do not learn anything about racism from Marx. There is this one extraordinary thing of turning Hegel around and looking at something emerging out of difference, which remains a very powerful thing. So I'm the wrong person to ask. Also, I come from, of course, you know, I'm Indian, and I come from West Bengal. And as of day before yesterday, it was the oldest communist state in existence within a parliamentary democracy. I mean, the Communist Party of Mexico was founded by Bengali, Emin Roy and so on. This is the Palme Dat, all kinds of stuff. So within this kind of a situation, the group that I have been identified with is the left of the left critique of a parliamentary left, which is itself getting now completely ruined because of the very bad policy of rural industrialization. So it's coming to an end. So therefore, my relationship to the texts of Marx is a second international Marxism, intellectual Marxism, you know, that's my state. It's very, I say this all the time. If I'm speaking, for example, in Austria, the next state is Croatia. If I'm speaking in Estonia, I never utter the word Marx. Because there is a history of what has been done in its name, which is rather different. It's the same kind of thing that, you know, the history of colonialism, what was done to the liberal philosophy, you know, Kant and so on and so forth, in the name of all of that within colonialism, is the same kind of thing. That doesn't mean I throw away Schiller, I sabotage Schiller. It's the same kind of thing. You wrest Marx out of the recent history and his European context.
May I ask just one follow-up question?
One thing on this one, specifically on Marx. I think our understanding of Marx today would be very different if the Soviet Union had not happened. If there had been no Lenin and no Stalin. we would then be able to recontextualize Marx as a sociologist of 19th century industrialization, actually rather narrow. It was really in New England by the time he was writing his major works. And I think the second problem with Marx, he did a long time and wrote far too much. He was many times contradicting himself, early Marx, late Marx. You'll remember all these arguments, which I think are pretty much dead now. So in a sense, one can try to recuperate Marx the sociologist by saying, okay, there's no Soviet Union, no communism, no Gulag, but it's very difficult to do that so soon in the countries which underwent it.
I agree with you. That's just why I said the word Marx didn't cross my lips when I was sitting here. Because one has to be historically aware. But I will also say that one of the problems with people like Benedict Anderson is that they don't realize that there is Marxism in Asia which is not necessarily sort of post-Bolshevik. You know what I mean? That's what I was saying, Second International Communism. So if this is a different kind of, I'm not particularly in support of this kind of intellectual Marxism which makes claims. I mean, in fact, right now, left intellectuals in West Bengal who are making a kind of rational choice for left vocabulary are defining something as Maoist, which I think they are dead wrong. And they're really doing great harm to subaltern populations. I'm much more with Gramsci, who thought that Marx had to be turned into an epistemological project. I mean, he wrote this. And so, yes, I agree with you. I think if all of this hadn't happened, then, but then you can't think of a counterfactual kind of
well,
thing.
yes, you can, and it's quite fun, but...
well, for instance, we are not reading very much Pareto and so on, so it's quite possible that Marx would have been out of circulation. Somebody would quote Marx, and then maybe new theories would have been built on him and so on, because he would not be a controversial theoretician, and he would be part of our intellectual history. Which actually brings me to something I wanted to say before. The humanities do not have history in the same sense as natural sciences have, because the things that Aristotle or Plato or Marx or Hobbes or all the great authors of Dante and so on, they have said they are still somehow in circulation, and therefore when we teach the humanities and we teach these things as historical things, we're actually mistaken, because if they are in circulation, that means that they can talk to us now. They are a part of our present contemporary culture. Not the same way as Lavoisier would be a part of contemporary chemistry, because he invented something, but something else has been invented since. So Lavoisier is definitely a figure of history, while Dante or Marx is a figure of today, because we can still talk about it.
This is why I said what I recounted what I say to my students, and I'm talking about graduate students, right? When we begin reading Marx and forget everything, just imagine that this book is getting written as if you are writing this book. Take the responsibility. That's a very different way. And before, when you were saying we learn to defend our positions, I've been actually boring Ren a little bit with all the talk about how this idea of debate, that is to say, you win arguments, you defend your position, etc., that this is not basically what we follow anymore. Many, many years ago, I wrote a piece called Explanation and Marginalia, where, in fact, I discussed a conference, and where I was told, but we remain, as you did tell me, we remain friends. Who doesn't know that you remain friends? That's not what I'm talking about. So, to an extent, this defending of these positions, like Kant corrected Descartes, Hegel corrected Kant, Marx corrected Hegel, Nietzsche corrected Marx, Freud corrected Nietzsche, Habermas corrected Freud, and my master is Habermas. This is this exact topic, idea of intellectual history or history of consciousness. That's what we find a little amusing. No, it's a part of a present. If we deal with it in terms of defense of ideas, whoever argues well will win. Hobbes made that distinction between winning arguments and speaking the truth, it seems to me. So yes, I agree with you, but we really must think about the humanities, not in that old model of dispute. That was when there was, the subject of the Enlightenment, as in Kant, was the Gelehrte, was the scholar. That's not the world we live in. You know what I mean? So yes, I agree with that little bit of a comment.
I'd like to ask, since you said that, comment on what you had learned from Marx. And I can't resist but ask the question, since I've seen again and again in your writing that you insist on bringing in the woman that has been excluded. Where have you learned your feminism? Where are you continuing to learn your feminism?
I have written about this. I didn't really learn feminism in any kind of systematic way. And I don't bring in the woman. As I was saying this afternoon or this morning, I believe, as I have slowly learned about this kind of thinking about culture, I've begun to see more and more that culture is written in gendering, and gender is our first instrument of abstraction. And in fact, people find this to be rather, especially American feminists find this to be not a very acceptable remark, because abstractions are bad, and we are all for concrete, etc., etc. But learning feminism, I've just written something for a book coming out of Berkeley College. Really my experience, my example are my foremothers. My great-grandmother, who was given in widow remarriage when she was married at 7, widowed at 11, and then married again at 13. She had 13 children, and so on and so forth. And she decided that she wanted, I get my stuff from them, right? She decided she wanted to be independent in some way. And so what could she do in the 19th century? She opened a pawn shop in the back door of her house, so that women who were distressed could come with their things, the edge of their sari down over their face, with the ornaments, and get money, right? This was my great-grandmother. And my mother said to me, I never saw her, my mother said to me that she gave me a pair of earrings that were not redeemed. And she said, she was the most independent woman in our family, and you are the most independent woman in this generation, so these are yours. So this is kind of a proto-feminist stuff. My father, for example, was able to recognize, and in my life I have not found this recognition. My father was able to recognize that his wife, who was only 14 years old, my father was able to recognize that she was an intellectual, not just that women should be educated. And so, in fact, in those days, my father was born in 1899, and he came from the village. In those days, they planned their children. My mother passed her high school exam, my brother was born. My mother got her BA in 1935, 1936 my sister was born, and so on. She finally got an MA. So, in Bengali literature. So, I had these kind of proto-feminist examples, right? And then my mother, and I've actually written about this, told me when I was 15 years old, I was in college, my father was dead, and I was a good-looking girl, and it was like a good family. Offers would come from my hand, and my mother would say, look dear, I don't think it's a good idea to marry in terms of libidinal, some kind of, being crazed. And she was speaking a very high Bengali, so libidinal is a good choice of adjective there. So she says, I don't necessarily think so. But with an arranged marriage, the parents have to, first of all, they investigate a great deal. And second of all, they have to know what will make the child happy. I was only 15. And she said, you already have so much of a life outside of the house, I do not know what will make you happy, I can't arrange your marriage. This was a 43-year-old Hindu widow, weddings are still being arranged. This was just an unbelievable gesture of giving me my freedom. Much, much later I read in Simone de Beauvoir, the situation of the mother, that the child exceeds the mother and so on. I didn't need to learn it in Simone de Beauvoir, because I had this example from my own mom. So that's how our our education into what is called feminism came to happen. But then the theoretical stuff, that was not just, I don't bring in women, no. I believe that this reproductive heteronormativity, where hetero is the antonym is auto. Remember what I said about Marx, coming out of difference? So that I believe is the biggest institution of validation in the world, both capitalists and workers, both colonials and the colonized. You name it, we are in a double bind with it. You love your mother, you're in a double bind with it. You hate your mother, you're in a double bind with it. The queer couples who are having children through the heteronormativity stuff are using it in what Nietzsche would call an extramoral sense. So that's very big. And this gendering business, culture, writing of culture through gendering, and you added death, and I agree with you. So that stuff is rather more than bringing in women. What I do bring in is class. That I do. That's an abstraction that's very interesting. People will say Indians, people will say Somalis, or people say Ethiopians do this. You have to think about what class does this, because there are indeed Ethiopians who are as intellectually gifted as you, and I suppose I can include myself also, and as educated, etc., who will not come and ask you for a gift on the street. See, so that I always bring in class, but women I don't bring in.
I have one thing here. To some extent we share a background. My mother was really the first generation to be educated. She was a doctor, and so this gave me a very unusual upbringing in terms of my own generation, because at that time, on the whole, women were not professionals. Nevertheless, the warning I would give is not everything is gendered. We can gender everything. We can reduce everything to gender. By the way, we can reduce everything to everything if you really want to. But I think there are certain neutral spaces where gendering isn't terribly relevant. And I think we have to be very careful in our understanding of, I'll use this word culture, I know we've much contested it today, that certain respects, a particular individual who is of either the same gender or another gender, we like them, we don't like them, not because necessarily the gender plays a central role, but because of who they are.
Exactly, we're running out of time. When you say gendering in that sense, it's like the difference between social and Marx.
Okay.
Because when I was saying gendering is our first instrument of abstraction, it's quite often upstream from some certain things. So you don't, that's why I said I don't bring in women. If you brought in gendering into everything, then it becomes a power game. I agree with you, but that doesn't really undermine the idea of abstraction.
I fully accept that, yes. Yes.
We are running out of time, but there's a question that has come up at several points, and I heard that you wanted to answer, and so I will pose it, and you can make a choice whether you want to or not. You mentioned yesterday you were uneasy or you didn't like cultural memory. Could you talk about what perhaps you wanted to say? You said you were going to say something publicly about cultural memory.
The concept of cultural memory, to me, is troubling because I think it happens through what is called rememoration. That is to say, this is a very, it's not just post-Holocaust or post-Soviet or anything, or post-Hindu in our case, That's not what I'm talking about. But this idea of really pre-colonial cultural initiation quite often is a kind of making young men especially participants in something like a cultural memory. I think it happens because I don't believe that you can make a psychological argument in terms of collective memories. What happens is that through incremental repetition, people begin to believe that there is a generally shared memory, and my own feeling is that it is better to think about the vulnerable veridicality of history. I'm not saying that history can be absolutely correct, but at least one should resist what I have called the privatization of history by invoking a memory shared by an entire folk which is really, and I have mentioned the sentimentalization of 9/11 in New York in this way, memory in the making. And so, in fact, I just wrote something about, people ask, why do they hate us so, etc. And I wrote about the Sykes-Picot conversations, the rewriting of that area of the world, which is called the Middle East now. And there, in fact, there was room for the making of a cultural memory in a population that didn't particularly think in these ways. And so therefore, as you can see, I'm a fairly impartial person here. I'm not voting for either this side or that side. But there is this room for making of cultural memories, which then, in Africa, for example, my colleague and friend Simon Gikandi, he talks about the fact, and this is quite like Israel as well, that you take a kind of sacred so-called narrative and you decide on genocide. And so, in fact, what Gikandi suggests is that humanities teachers Africans should take the responsibility of rethinking these narratives. I think that's a fantastically responsible way of understanding the humanities teacher's task. So this is why there, if you like, a counter-construction of cultural memory in the name of undoing cultural memory leads to a certain kind of politics. You see, that's where I think, of course, in one's own country, since everybody is suffering from these post-Soviet things, you can say, oh yes, cultural memory, we suffer, etc., Second World War. Yes, I'm not undermining these things. It's all right, but that doesn't make me feel that the idea of cultural memory is a useful one in a general extramoral sense, as it were.
You have actually answered a question that came to my mind when you were speaking about whether we as private persons do not also reconstruct and rememorize our memories, because somebody tells me that this was what I experienced in my childhood and I start to remember that. But now that you tell that you said about the rethinking of narratives, which actually brings us back to the beginning of our discussion, the rearrangement of desire, and also the rearrangement of elements of what make us up, the narratives, and the imagined pasts and so on. This is really very...
I hope when desire becomes greed, I'm sorry to be so boring, but the collapsing of the commercial banks and the investment banks, and the whole world is suffering. Maybe that can be rearranged a little. You know what I mean? That's all. I said this in Kerala, and they put a deadline. Spivak says greed can be rearranged.
Oh, I think it can be.
It's still easier to rearrange memories than history.
We've been told that our time is up, and I would like to thank you very much, Professor Spivak, for being willing to continue the conversation. And we're very grateful that you found the time and the space to come to Estonia. And we hope that your journey from here on will be one that is full of fortune, blessing, opportunity, and the kind of teaching that you have done with us.
And